It's been long known that obesity is a risk factor for severe COVID-19, but in today's session, we're going to break down two new papers finding for the very first time that SARS-CoV-2 infects the fat tissue itself, meaning that the virus goes into the fat cells where it causes this vicious cycle of inflammatory cascades that worsen blood sugar. We know that elevated levels of blood sugar and insulin resistance are a major contributing factor to increasing disease severity and death from acute respiratory distress syndrome and hospitalization. So that's the first thing that's problematic. Then the second study from scientists at Stanford recently discovered, again, for the first time, that the fat tissue itself harbors a significant quantity of virus. And the immune cells that are contained within the visceral fat that are characteristic of being overweight or obese, and this can be found as in young children as well, by the way, visceral adiposity and inflammatory changes within the fat cell happens at an early age, friends. This is linked with this vicious cycle of inflammation that leads to increased coagulation and damage to other local organs around the viscera, like the kidneys, other critical organs, the liver, and much more. So these are really important studies. Again, if we're really serious about preventing the hospitals from being overfilled, preventing deaths, saving grandma and grandpa and all that, we should be promoting the findings from these studies because it really comes down to healthy living and healthy lifestyle and making sure that we don't have these over-enlarged abdomens and this inflammatory fat tissue that is so prone to not only accumulating this virus, as the autopsy studies in this one research paper from Stanford found in 8 subjects, that the quantities of virus were highest in the lung tissue, followed by the visceral fat tissue. And then, of course, the cardiovascular system and kidney tissue. So again, this is so important. If we're very serious about making sure it's our civic duty to do everything we can to prevent being another statistic or transmitting the virus or, heaven forbid, ending up in a hospital, then we should understand the physiology and make the appropriate lifestyle mitigation strategies to become healthier. So let's dive in to this first study. To me, I get so excited about this because, well, it's been long known that inflammatory visceral adipose tissue is a problem. There's been this suspicion and this term been thrown around called infectObesity, where obesity not only causes more severe infections, but then infections can exacerbate the problems and complications linked with obesity, where it's a sort of bidirectional system. So this new paper from Stanford, the title here is SARS-CoV-2 infects human adipose tissue and elicits an inflammatory response consistent with COVID-19. The scientists in this first paper that found that fat tissue gets directly infected by SARS-CoV-2, they undertook the first study to test the hypothesis that SARS-CoV-2 infects cells within human adipose tissue and incites an inflammatory response. They harvested adipose tissue for multiple depots in uninfected obese individuals that were getting bariatric surgery, and they indeed found that SARS-CoV-2 infects the fat tissue. And then they obtained autopsies from specimens that had died, unfortunately, from COVID-19. And their results clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 infection in macrophages and fat cells. I'll talk about the macrophages in a moment. It's interesting. And they infect the fat cells in multiple adipose tissue depots, not just the visceral fat, but pre-adipocytes and subcutaneous fat as well. Okay. And this eventually culminates in an increased inflammatory profile, which is not good. So we know that inflammation is problematic. You can measure your baseline inflammation. I recommend clients do this all the time by looking at their C-reactive protein. There's other biomarkers that you can look at, interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, but that gets a little more nuanced. CRP is a good way to look at that, and also getting a DEXA scan, looking at your body fat percentage and where you carry your fat. If you have a lot of fat in and around the abdomen, it's much more linked with increased levels of chronic inflammation compared to the subcutaneous fat that's found on the back of the arms and the glutes and the hamstrings. Now, I just want to mention, as we continue on, we're not just going to talk about all the bad stuff. I'm going to sprinkle in practical tips to help just remind you that there's ways that you can tame this sort of fat on fire concept. And if you're new to this understanding, and if you want, again, this is an older book. I wrote this in 2014. The thesis of the book is fat cell inflammation is linked at the root cause of inability to lose weight. So there's more on that. I'll link below, belly fat effect. You can check that out, which I am revising, but you should know about, that data if you're so inclined. So the virus infects fat cells and the macrophages that are found in and around fat tissue. Now, it's important to understand that the macrophages actually start to increase and infiltrate the visceral adipose tissue. Friends, this starts at an early age. There are some histological samples of children as young as 5 that as their belly enlarges, it gets infiltrated by these different macrophages. And these macrophages, based upon this new research from Stanford, they get infected by SARS-CoV-2. So it's not just the fat cells themselves, it's the immunologically active tissue in and around the adipose tissue, particularly around the visceral fat, that also get concomitantly infected, which then causes a spillover of inflammatory cytokines that worsen blood sugar control and possibly damage organs and lead to clotting that culminate in strokes, deep vein thrombosis, and all the challenges that are associated with that. Okay, so what's known? Just quick review. Obesity is a stronger risk factor for severe disease and hypertension and type 2 diabetes. Again, these are the words of the Stanford scientists. It's even a stronger risk factor for young adults and children who don't have other comorbid underlying health conditions. So you've seen the pictures of the perfectly healthy children in the hospital. Well, guess what? Some of these perfectly healthy children, they don't look very lean to me. I don't know about you, but I've seen quite a few morbidly obese, children that the media says are perfectly healthy, no underlying health conditions, outside of the fact that they have 100 to 200 pounds of excess of fat. And as you're soon going to learn, that is a problem. So we need to address this. So the scientists say of particular concern is the possibility that viral infections of peri-organ fat could contribute to organ damage via inflammation and downstream processes such as extracellular matrix deposition, fibrosis, edema, impaired cellular function, endothelial dysfunction, and hypercoagulability. So the endothelial dysfunction is a problem because when the vessels lose their elasticity and get stiff and so forth, that is a problem for tissue oxygenation and perfusion. So you want to have endothelial function, just a small little thing to remember. Endothelial dysfunction, ED, is linked with ED, erectile dysfunction. So when your blood vessels when they lose their suppleness, there is functional declines in the ability of tissues to do what they need to do. So this study looked at 8 deceased COVID-19 patients, finding fat cells harbored the second highest concentration of SARS-CoV-2, only behind the lung. And then thirdly and fourthly was the heart and kidney. Okay, so if you think about the cycle thresholds with the PCR testing, the cycle thresholds for the amount of viral DNA was second only to the lung in these autopsies. And so, but the biggest finding here is SARS-CoV-2 infection drives an inflammatory response in the macrophages that are found and concentrated in and around, particularly the visceral fat. Overweight and obese people have very high concentrations of macrophages in and around fat tissue. So really interesting stuff. The authors said, we also demonstrated histological evidence of inflammation adjacent to viral signals in adipose tissue in an autopsy sample. Together, these analysis of adipose tissue susceptibility and inflammatory response to SARS-CoV-2 infection suggests that adipose tissue may serve as a potential reservoir for SARS-CoV-2. Okay, let me just pause right there. We've talked about this a lot, that viral load is much higher in people who are overweight or obese. Now, again, we hear about the media, or people in your neighborhood get mad at you for checking your mail without a mask or running outside. Remember how the disdain that you got for just going outside on a walk in August of 2020, like you were going to kill someone by just taking your family on a bike ride? It's like metabolically healthy people who take care of themselves, they have a significantly lower viral load. We've talked a lot about that before. So this is important. If we're serious about reducing the burden on the healthcare system, we need to be serious about addressing the elephant in the room, which is the obesity overweight epidemic. We need to be serious about why is it that there are tens or dozens of cars at every drive-through that you go to, every fast food restaurant. They're all slammed. I see there's a Jack in the Box near me, a McDonald's, a Chick-fil-A. It's embarrassing how busy they are. And ostensibly, everyone is doing everything they can to save their neighbor and save lives. Yet, why are the drive-through lines slammed? Why are people buying Kit Kat bars and liters of soda? Why is that okay, but you need to show a passport to go to a football game? I mean, it absolutely makes no sense. but I digress. The scientists go on to say that because the fat tissue is a potential reservoir for SARS-CoV-2 and potentiator of systemic inflammation and regional inflammation, possibly contributing to severe clinical disease that is linked with the acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, that we're going to talk about in a moment. So really interesting stuff. Now, this is new with regards to COVID, but it's not new in the field of infectobesity because viruses of all kinds have been shown to infect fat cells and the immune cells that are frequently found in dysfunctional fat tissue. So really, really interesting stuff. Now let's get to a related study again by Stanford scientists. This study, you'll see on the screen, prettier images than the other one. This was published in Cell Metabolism. I want to thank my friend Ben Bickman, Dr. Ben Bickman at BYU University for sharing this. The title here is Hyperglycemia in Acute COVID-19 is Characterized by Insulin Resistance and Adipose Tissue Infectivity by SARS-CoV-2. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that we're going to dive into with this particular study because it has to do with blood sugar control, glycemic variability, and the hyperglycemia that is characteristic of severe disease. Again, if you want to prevent people from landing in the ICU and bogging down the healthcare system, we need to work on metabolic health. We're going to talk a lot about that. But first, friends, I want to welcome you back. It is Mike Mutzel. As always, I'm grateful that you're here. There's a few things you can do if you've been enjoying this video so far and you're looking forward to the upcoming content with regards to blood sugar health. Please hit that like button, leave a comment below. That really helps the algorithm. And people like you who are looking for solutions to help their family members make better lifestyle choices, that goes a long way. So I always read all your comments. I really appreciate your comments and your engagement. Also, we're going to talk about adipose tissue or fat cell dysfunction. We're going to get into some of the solutions like cold immersions, like exercise, like intermittent fasting, like eating a low carb, low glycemic index diet. All of those factors are a great way to take the dimmer switch down on this inflammatory vicious cycle that is characteristic of being overweight and obese. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about leptin and adiponectin. I just want to give you a small plug. Our sister company, Myoscience, we now are offering testing, at-home testing. This is an omega-3 index test. You're going to hear a lot about adiponectin very soon. This is a related adipocytokine to leptin. And I just want you to know that low omega-3 levels are correlated with low adiponectin levels. You want higher adiponectin levels, and you're going to learn why in just a moment, why they're so important. So there's this at-home test that can help you assess the omega-3 fatty acid status in your body, in your blood, and you want to be closer to 8%. A lot of people, I find with my clients, a lot of people in the research shows us, their omega-3 index is around 5%, which is not good. So this at-home test can help you determine if you're getting enough whole food derived omega-3 fats in your diet, like having fish and things like that. I found, that grass-fed meat doesn't contain a lot of omega-3. So this was a great test. It's $49. You can use a coupon code podcast at checkout to see if you're overdoing the omega-3s. If you, like some people are taking tons of fish oil and krill oil, that could be too much of a good thing, or if you're not getting enough. So this is a great test to determine that and decide if whether or not you should be taking omega-3 supplements or eating more fish in your diet. So definitely check that out over at myoscience.com. Please use the coupon code podcast at checkout. That's podcast over at myoscience.com to save. So what is new in this paper? Well, the new findings here are that hyperglycemia is highly prevalent in severe COVID-19. Now, we've known that. Insulin resistance is the main cause of this hyperglycemia. So nothing really new there, but here's what's really, really new, is that patients with COVID-19, and then they also had an animal arm of the study, hamsters, infected with SARS-CoV-2, have decreased adiponectin levels. I was just mentioning what that is. Adiponectin is this adipocytokine, kind of like leptin, meaning it's a hormone and cytokine released from fat tissue that helps to regulate blood sugar. So look, we hear so much about insulin and blood sugar. Well, your fat cells and your muscle, there's like this triad, right? Your pancreas, your fat cells, your liver, your muscle, those are all intimately connected with blood sugar regulation. So if your liver is screwed up, your blood sugar is going to be off. If you have low muscle mass or insulin resistant muscle, your blood sugar is going to be off. If your fat cells are overfilled and inflamed, your blood sugar is going to be dysregulated. And it turns out because this virus infects fat cells, and if you already have fat cells that are engulfed with macrophages and other immune cells, and they're even more prone to being even more inflamed. And that might cause this dysregulation in blood sugar that can be one of many contributing factors to having a severe disease. So we have to focus on the fat cells. Now, how do we do this? We're going to talk a lot about that, but let me just break this down real quick. The last main takeaway here is SARS-CoV-2 can directly infect human and mouse adipose tissue. Now, you might be thinking, well, gosh, haven't you talked about this study before? Friends, these are two different studies, again, by Stanford scientists. Now, I like to mention this because when you share these with your friends and family who are wearing face shields and 5 face masks, they don't believe the things you say. Okay, so just remember, 2 studies from Stanford show essentially the same thing, that fat cells get infected and that infectivity of fat cells worsen all the sequelae that will likely land you in the hospital, okay? Really important stuff. So this is why you shouldn't drink the soda and eat the Kit Kat bars, and why you should walk more often and lift weights and possibly take omega-3 supplements because of the fat tissue. So we're going to dive into that, but it's been long known that hyperglycemia is a problem. Elevated glucose and higher levels of glucose extend hospital stays. They're linked with the major problem that is associated with the SARS-CoV-2 infection, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, and increased mortality. Here's really important stuff. I mean, this could be a nice little clip to share with your friends and family. Hyperglycemia, with or without a history of diabetes, is a strong predictor of in-hospital adverse outcomes, portending a 7-fold higher mortality compared with patients with well-controlled glucose levels. 7-fold higher mortality, my friends. A lot of people are running around, according to the data, NHANES data, it's like 87% of Americans are metabolically unwell. Not all of those Americans have hyperglycemia, which is defined as a blood glucose level equal to or over 170 milligrams per DL. But that there's a lot of people that have cookies or go have lunch at Chick-fil-A or McDonald's, and their glucose levels are over 200 in the post-meal window, which is going to be, that's hyperglycemia, my friend. So this paper suggests that hyperglycemia in severe disease may be due to fat cell dysfunction itself. And so really important stuff. Now, it's well known that, some of the treatments that are used with really sick COVID patients worsen blood sugar levels, dexamethasone and corticosteroids and things like that. But the study controlled for that and adjusted for that. But here's what they really found that was quite interesting is high levels of leptin and low levels of adiponectin were, after looking at all the data with people that had ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome with COVID, and people that had ARDS without COVID, to figure out, hey, is it the ARDS that's worsening the blood sugar control? And what they figured out is looking at all these different, sample cohorts to figure out where's the direction of causality? What is causing the blood sugar dysregulation? They found that, high leptin and low adiponectin keep coming up, suggesting that there is fat cell dysfunction that is contributing to the problem that is characteristic of COVID-19. So it turns out that is probably the cause, and they suggest that this may be the root cause, and that is because these fat cells get inflamed and the associated immunologic tissue around the fat tissue get infected, the macrophages that we've talked about, get infected by SARS-CoV-2, and that could be skewing these so-called adipocytokines that's causing the blood sugar to go out of control. So important stuff to sort of keep in mind there. So again, if saving lives matter, why aren't we talking about this stuff? I mean, it's absolutely amazing. So just a little bit more about this particular study. Patients that were hospitalized at New York Presbyterian Hospital and also Weill Cornell Medical Center and affiliated campuses, there was 3,800 patients that were diagnosed with COVID-19, and they were part of this cohort study and so forth. What they found with regards to the contributing factors and how hyperglycemia contributes to death and so forth, 91% of intubated patients, that is patients who go on a ventilator, had hyperglycemia. 72% of patients that died had hyperglycemia. So it doesn't mean that elevated glucose levels kill you directly. It's the way in which those elevated glucose levels happen, why they're happening, and the downstream consequences of that. So again, just remember, hyperglycemia is characterized by elevated glucose levels above 170 milligrams per DL. So the lab values and all the statistics and things like that you've been seeing here on the screen on YouTube basically show that it's the fat cell that's the problem. So there were significant changes in both insulin, glucose, leptin, and adiponectin in individuals who had ARDS with COVID compared to just ARDS patients. So they also went on, these scientists, to use animal models to see, well, okay, so if we're seeing this in the humans, we're seeing these skewed leptin and adiponectin levels, let's look at animals and sort of see. And then they biopsied, they used in vitro studies to use the virus to infect both the fat cells of hamsters and also of humans. But these weren't living humans. These were, again, they did tissue samples, an in vitro tissue culture study finding that SARS-CoV-2 infects the fat cells, eliciting a robust inflammatory response, causing fat cell dysfunction, leading to insulin resistance. Again, when we think about insulin resistance, Ben Bickman and others have done a good job of helping us to reframe what is causing insulin resistance. But fat tissue dysfunction doesn't get a lot of airtime because people are like, what do you mean? What is fat cell dysfunction? How do you measure that? Well, if you do a DEXA scan and you find that you have a lot of fat in and around your abdomen, that's probably dysfunctional. So you got to work on that. You got to work on reducing the quantities of visceral fat. So as we finish up here, what do we do with this information? Let's just talk about the fat cells in general. So the biggest thing that you can do that I think is under-recognized, I know a lot of you are already exercising, but walking after a meal and eating earlier in the day, I think doesn't get a lot of emphasis like it should. So, there's a lot of really good data to show that if you walk at your expected peak of glucose levels, which for most people happens around 45 minutes to 60 minutes after a meal, you just totally squash that down. I think that is a really important thing that we can all, it's really affordable, accessible, we should be focusing on. So walking after a meal, around 45 to 60 minutes after a meal, eating a lower glycemic index diet. So, look, you can be vegan, you can be vegetarian, you can be paleo, low carb, carnivore, whatever. The refined processed carbohydrates, not really doing you a good service, right? And we know that high levels of glucose, high levels of leptin does deposit more energy into insulin. High glucose. So we know that high levels of glucose, high levels of insulin causes hormonal recipe to increase fat storage. And we know that fat storage and overfilled fat cells are part of the problem. So the lower glycemic index of the diet, squashing down that glucose by walking is helpful. Intermittent fasting, we've talked about, really helpful, compressing that feeding window. There might be additional benefits to a 16-hour fast versus just an 12-hour fast. So time-restricted feeding, eating earlier in the day, starting your fast earlier can be helpful. Omega-3 fat supplements, as we talked about, testing with the omega-3 index might be helpful because of the fact that omega-3s have been shown to actually raise adiponectin. As you just learned about adiponectin, a really important adipocytokine that's involved in blood sugar regulation and insulin sensitivity. You should know, if you need to support your body with omega-3 supplements, I'll put links below for all of that. Resistance training, very helpful because you're signaling the muscle tissue and talking to the liver and the fat cells, all of that's important. And sleep, we need to focus on sleep. A lot of people that I work with, their sleep-wake cycles totally suck. And we know that circadian rhythm disruption, your fat tissue has a circadian rhythm, circadian clock. So we got to focus on that. So try to go to bed and rise at the same time every day. And last, but certainly not least, this should be number one, get cold on purpose. We know that brown adipose tissue, that BAT, that's found in higher concentration in babies, but you can induce your own fat cells to behave and act like brown fat. So getting cold on purpose, cold immersions, cold showers, there's really good evidence and data to suggest that might help improve the behavior of your fat tissue. And last but maybe not least, and I should have included it in the diet section, is having refined fats with refined carbs is a recipe for causing fat cell dysfunction. So think about pizza, think about milkshakes, high quantities of ice cream. If you think about even a cheeseburger with the bun and the bacon and all of that, processed carbs, highly refined fats or liquid fats together is a recipe for fat cell dysfunction. Again, I'm not trying to plug my book here, Belly Fat Effect, but we talked a lot about metabolic endotoxemia by consuming those types of foods together. Bad news bears for your fat tissue. So try to have more sort of complex, more saturated animal type fats without, carbohydrates, right? So you're not having those two things together. So French fries, another bad example. You do not want to be eating those things together. So friends, really exciting stuff. What do you think about this? Let me know in the chat below. Let me know on iTunes what you think here. I think this is fascinating. I just share this with you because I think you like these studies. Maybe you're getting bored of them, but I don't know. Hopefully you have a great rest of your weekend. If you want this shirt, Eat Like Your Life Depends on It, it will be in the show notes below. We have a lot of good merch to help you spread the message that we should make healthy living the main thing going forward. So have an awesome rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you soon. Bye now.